I overheard my son's voice through the kitchen door, his words clear despite his attempt to whisper. "She won't live much longer," he told his wife, the confidence in his tone chilling me to the bone. "Once Mom's gone, we'll finally get everything. The house, the money, all of it." I stood frozen, my arthritis-stiffened hands clutching the teacup I'd been about to bring them, my own flesh and blood discussing my death as casually as one might discuss the weather. 3 days later, I called my lawyer and left everything I owned to Emma, the college student who'd been watching my grandchildren for the past 2 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon sun filtered through the living room curtains, casting long shadows across the antique furniture I'd collected over a lifetime. The house was quiet now, peaceful in a way it hadn't been during my son's visit. I sat in my favorite armchair, staring at the freshly signed will on the coffee table before me. The document looked so ordinary, just papers with legal jargon and signatures, yet it represented the most defiant act of my 76 years of life. My hands still trembled slightly, not from age, but from the weight of what I'd just done. I hadn't told anyone yet. Not my son Robert, certainly not his wife Patricia, and not even Emma herself. How do you tell a 23-year-old college student that you've made her the heir to your entire estate? A Victorian home in Lakeside Heights, investment accounts, and family heirlooms collected across generations. I glanced at the small, silver-framed photograph on the side table, Robert as a little boy, gap-toothed and beaming, his father's arm around his shoulders. Harold had been gone 15 years now, and sometimes I wondered if our son would have turned out differently if his father had lived longer. The thought brought a familiar ache, but I pushed it aside. Sentimentality wouldn't change what I'd heard with my own ears. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 4 times, pulling me from my thoughts. Emma would be arriving soon to tell me about her final exams. Unlike my son, who visited out of obligation, checking on his investment as I now realized, Emma came because she genuinely enjoyed our conversations. She asked about my garden, remembered my stories, and looked at me as if I still mattered in this world. I rose slowly, joints protesting after sitting too long, and made my way to the kitchen. The least I could do was have tea ready for her arrival. As I filled the kettle, I remembered how this unlikely friendship had begun. It was 2 years ago when Patricia had called in a panic. Their regular babysitter had quit without notice, and they needed someone to watch the children while they attended a charity gala. Emma was the daughter of Patricia's coworker, a nursing student looking for part-time work. I had offered to watch my grandchildren myself, but Robert had brushed aside my offer with concerns about my energy levels and safety. Emma had arrived at their house that evening to find me already there, having insisted on at least helping. We'd hit it off immediately. She was bright, attentive, and genuinely kind. When my grandchildren finally fell asleep, we spent hours discussing everything from her studies to my experiences as a former high school principal. By the time Robert and Patricia returned home, Emma had already asked if she could visit me for tea sometime just to continue our conversation. What began as occasional afternoon tea evolved into a weekly tradition. Every Thursday at 4, Emma would arrive with stories from her classes or clinical rotations, and I would share wisdom accumulated over decades. Sometimes she even took notes. When her car broke down last winter, she'd walked 30 minutes, in the snow rather than miss our appointment. Robert, meanwhile, lived just across town but couldn't manage to visit more than once a month. The doorbell rang, interrupting my reverie. I smoothed my cardigan, tucked the will into the drawer of the side table, and went to answer the door. "Mrs. Lancaster." Emma's smile was bright as always, her dark curls wind-blown. She carried a small paper bag from the local bakery. "I brought those lemon scones you loved from last time." "You spoil me, dear," I said, ushering her in. "And, please, I've told you 100 times to call me Eleanor." "Old habits," she laughed, following me to the kitchen where the tea was ready. As we settled into our usual places at the kitchen table, I studied her face. She looked tired. Finals week had taken its toll, but her eyes still held that spark of determination I'd come to admire. Emma had worked her way through college, without family support, taking extra shifts at the hospital to cover expenses her scholarships didn't. She never complained, though I knew she struggled. "How were your exams?" I asked, pouring the tea. "Brutal," she admitted. "But I think I did well. Just one more year and I'll finally be a registered nurse." "You'll be an excellent nurse," I said with certainty. "You have the perfect combination of intelligence and compassion." She blushed at the compliment, then launched into a story about an elderly patient she'd cared for during her clinical rotation. How she'd discovered the woman hadn't been taking her medication because she couldn't afford it, and how Emma had connected her with social services to get assistance. As she spoke, I felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with biological connection. This was what legacy truly meant, not passing down material possessions, but nurturing the next generation to be better than our own. Emma would do good, things with my resources in ways my son never would. "Eleanor, are you all right?" Emma was looking at me with concern. "You seemed far away for a moment." I reached across the table and patted her hand. "Just thinking about how proud I am of the person you're becoming." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Later that evening, after Emma had left, Robert called. His voice held the artificial cheerfulness he always used when he wanted something. "Mom, Patricia and I were thinking we should go through some of that old furniture in the spare bedroom this weekend. You know, help you declutter a bit." Translation: They wanted to start claiming items before I was even gone. "That won't be necessary," I replied calmly. "I've been organizing things myself." "But Mom, you shouldn't be lifting heavy things or making those decisions alone," he protested, concern dripping from every insincere word. "We're just trying to help." "I'm perfectly capable of deciding what to do with my own belongings, Robert," I said, my voice firmer than he was used to hearing. The silence that followed told me he was surprised by my resistance. We'd fallen into a pattern over the years. He would suggest what was best for me, and I would acquiesce to keep the peace. Not anymore. "Well," he finally said, "at least, let us take you to dinner on Sunday. We haven't seen you in a while." The irony wasn't lost on me. 3 days ago, he couldn't wait for me to die. Now he wanted family dinner. "I'm afraid I have plans on Sunday," I lied. "Perhaps another time." After we hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my living room, the weight of my decision settling around me like a comfortable shawl. I thought about Robert as a child. How he would run to show me his drawings, how his face would light up when I attended his baseball games, how he once saved his allowance for months to buy me a birthday gift. When had that sweet boy turned into a man who could coldly discuss his mother's death as a financial opportunity? The answer came more easily than I expected. It hadn't happened overnight. It had been a slow erosion of character, enabled partly by my own unwillingness to see it. I had made excuses for his growing materialism, his increasing distance, his thinly veiled impatience with my aging. I had blamed Patricia's influence, his stressful job, the pressures of raising children in today's world, everything except the possibility that my son had simply chosen to become someone who valued things over people. The revelation brought tears, but also clarity. I couldn't change Robert, but I could ensure that my life's work, the savings I'd carefully built, the home I'd lovingly maintained, went to someone who would honor its value beyond mere dollars. Someone who understood that true wealth was measured in kindness, in connections, in making a difference in others' lives. I picked up the phone and dialed my lawyer's number again. "James, It's Eleanor Lancaster. I've been thinking about our meeting today, and I'd like to add a codicil to the will. The next morning, I woke with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I dressed with care, choosing a blue dress Harold had always loved, and drove myself to the bank. The young manager looked surprised when I asked to access my safe deposit box and requested a private room. Inside the box were the items too precious to keep at home: Harold's pocket watch, my grandmother's pearl necklace, the first dollar I'd earned as a teacher framed alongside my final paycheck as principal. I selected several pieces of jewelry, including the diamond earrings Harold had given me on our 40th anniversary, and placed them in my purse. My next stop was the university campus where Emma had mentioned she studied between classes. I found her in the library, surrounded by textbooks, her forehead creased in concentration. She looked up in surprise when I approached. I overheard my son's voice through the kitchen door, his words clear despite his attempt to whisper. "She won't live much longer," he told his wife, the confidence in his tone chilling me to the bone. "Once Mom's gone, we'll finally get everything. The house, the money, all of it." I stood frozen, my arthritis-stiffened hands clutching the teacup I'd been about to bring them, my own flesh and blood discussing my death as casually as one might discuss the weather. 3 days later, I called my lawyer and left everything I owned to Emma, the college student who'd been watching my grandchildren for the past 2 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon sun filtered through the living room curtains, casting long shadows across the antique furniture I'd collected over a lifetime. The house was quiet now, peaceful in a way it hadn't been during my son's visit. I sat in my favorite armchair, staring at the freshly signed will on the coffee table before me. The document looked so ordinary, just papers with legal jargon and signatures, yet it represented the most defiant act of my 76 years of life. My hands still trembled slightly, not from age, but from the weight of what I'd just done. I hadn't told anyone yet. Not my son Robert, certainly not his wife Patricia, and not even Emma herself. How do you tell a 23-year-old college student that you've made her the heir to your entire estate? A Victorian home in Lakeside Heights, investment accounts, and family heirlooms collected across generations. I glanced at the small, silver-framed photograph on the side table, Robert as a little boy, gap-toothed and beaming, his father's arm around his shoulders. Harold had been gone 15 years now, and sometimes I wondered if our son would have turned out differently if his father had lived longer. The thought brought a familiar ache, but I pushed it aside. Sentimentality wouldn't change what I'd heard with my own ears. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 4 times, pulling me from my thoughts. Emma would be arriving soon to tell me about her final exams. Unlike my son, who visited out of obligation, checking on his investment as I now realized, Emma came because she genuinely enjoyed our conversations. She asked about my garden, remembered my stories, and looked at me as if I still mattered in this world. I rose slowly, joints protesting after sitting too long, and made my way to the kitchen. The least I could do was have tea ready for her arrival. As I filled the kettle, I remembered how this unlikely friendship had begun. It was 2 years ago when Patricia had called in a panic. Their regular babysitter had quit without notice, and they needed someone to watch the children while they attended a charity gala. Emma was the daughter of Patricia's coworker, a nursing student looking for part-time work. I had offered to watch my grandchildren myself, but Robert had brushed aside my offer with concerns about my energy levels and safety. Emma had arrived at their house that evening to find me already there, having insisted on at least helping. We'd hit it off immediately. She was bright, attentive, and genuinely kind. When my grandchildren finally fell asleep, we spent hours discussing everything from her studies to my experiences as a former high school principal. By the time Robert and Patricia returned home, Emma had already asked if she could visit me, for tea sometime just to continue our conversation. What began as occasional afternoon tea evolved into a weekly tradition. Every Thursday at 4, Emma would arrive with stories from her classes or clinical rotations, and I would share wisdom accumulated over decades. Sometimes she even took notes. When her car broke down last winter, she'd walked 30 minutes, in the snow rather than miss our appointment. Robert, meanwhile, lived just across town but couldn't manage to visit more than once a month. The doorbell rang, interrupting my reverie. I smoothed my cardigan, tucked the will into the drawer of the side table, and went to answer the door. Mrs. Lancaster. Emma's smile was bright as always, her dark curls wind-blown. She carried a small paper bag from the local bakery. I brought those lemon scones you loved from last time. You spoil me, dear, I said, ushering her in. And, please, I've told you 100 times to call me Eleanor. Old habits, she laughed, following me to the kitchen where the tea was ready. As we settled into our usual places at the kitchen table, I studied her face. She looked tired. Finals week had taken its toll, but her eyes still held that spark of determination I'd come to admire. Emma had worked her way through college, without family support, taking extra shifts at the hospital to cover expenses her scholarships didn't. She never complained, though I knew she struggled. How were your exams? I asked, pouring the tea. Brutal, she admitted. But I think I did well. Just one more year and I'll finally be a registered nurse. You'll be an excellent nurse, I said with certainty. You have the perfect combination of intelligence and compassion. She blushed at the compliment, then launched into a story about an elderly patient she'd cared for during her clinical rotation. How she'd discovered the woman hadn't been taking her medication because she couldn't afford it, and how Emma had connected her with social services to get assistance. As she spoke, I felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with biological connection. This was what legacy truly meant, not passing down material possessions, but nurturing the next generation to be better than our own. Emma would do good, things with my resources in ways my son never would. Eleanor, are you all right? Emma was looking at me with concern. You seemed far away for a moment. I reached across the table and patted her hand. Just thinking about how proud I am of the person you're becoming. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Later that evening, after Emma had left, Robert called. His voice held the artificial cheerfulness he always used when he wanted something. Mom, Patricia and I were thinking we should go through some of that old furniture in the spare bedroom this weekend. You know, help you declutter a bit. Translation. They wanted to start claiming items before I was even gone. That won't be necessary, I replied calmly. I've been organizing things myself. But Mom, you shouldn't be lifting heavy things or making those decisions alone, he protested, concern dripping from every insincere word. We're just trying to help. I'm perfectly capable of deciding what to do with my own belongings, Robert, I said, my voice firmer than he was used to hearing. The silence that followed told me he was surprised by my resistance. We'd fallen into a pattern over the years. He would suggest what was best for me, and I would acquiesce to keep the peace. Not anymore. Well, he finally said, at least, let us take you to dinner on Sunday. We haven't seen you in a while. The irony wasn't lost on me. 3 days ago, he couldn't wait for me to die. Now he wanted family dinner. I'm afraid I have plans on Sunday, I lied. Perhaps another time. After we hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my living room, the weight of my decision settling around me like a comfortable shawl. I thought about Robert as a child. How he would run to show me his drawings, how his face would light up when I attended his baseball games, how he once saved his allowance for months to buy me a birthday gift. When had that sweet boy turned into a man who could coldly discuss his mother's death as a financial opportunity? The answer came more easily than I expected. It hadn't happened overnight. It had been a slow erosion of character, enabled partly by my own unwillingness to see it. I had made excuses for his growing materialism, his increasing distance, his thinly veiled impatience with my aging. I had blamed Patricia's influence, his stressful job, the pressures of raising children in today's world, everything except the possibility that my son had simply chosen to become someone who valued things over people. The revelation brought tears, but also clarity. I couldn't change Robert, but I could ensure that my life's work, the savings I'd carefully built, the home I'd lovingly maintained, went to someone who would honor its value beyond mere dollars. Someone who understood that true wealth was measured in kindness, in connections, in making a difference in others' lives. I picked up the phone and dialed my lawyer's number again. "James, it's Eleanor Lancaster. I've been thinking about our meeting today, and I'd like to add a codicil to the will." The next morning, I woke with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I dressed with care, choosing a blue dress Harold had always loved, and drove myself to the bank. The young manager looked surprised when I asked to access my safe deposit box and requested a private room. Inside the box were the items too precious to keep at home: Harold's pocket watch, my grandmother's pearl necklace, the first dollar I'd earned as a teacher framed alongside my final paycheck as principal. I selected several pieces of jewelry, including the diamond earrings Harold had given me on our 40th anniversary, and placed them in my purse. My next stop was the university campus where Emma had mentioned she studied between classes. I found her in the library, surrounded by textbooks, her forehead creased in concentration. She looked up in surprise when I approached. "What Emma wants is a relationship, something you seem to have forgotten the value of." "This is ridiculous." Robert stood up abruptly. "You're being manipulated, and you can't even see it. If Dad were here, if your father were here, I interrupted. "He would be heartbroken to see what you've become. Harold valued people, not possessions. He taught you to do the same, but somewhere along the way, you forgot those lessons." Robert's face hardened. "I'm calling Dr. Matthews. You're clearly not thinking clearly. Maybe it's time to discuss your capacity to manage your own affairs." The threat hung in the air between us. I felt a momentary flicker of fear. Could they really have me declared incompetent simply because I wouldn't bend to their will? But I pushed it aside. "By all means, call him," I said calmly. "I had a complete physical and cognitive assessment just last month. Dr. Matthews will be happy to confirm that I'm of perfectly sound mind. And I'm sure he'll be interested to hear why you're suddenly concerned about my mental capacity immediately after learning I've updated my will." Robert and Patricia exchanged another glance, this one tinged with uncertainty. Their plan was unraveling, and they knew it. "Mom?" Robert tried one last approach, his voice softening. "We love you. We're just worried about you. All this secrecy, these sudden changes. It's not like you." "You're right about one thing," I agreed. "It's not like the person I've been for the past several years. Someone who avoided conflict at all costs, who put everyone else's needs before her own, who shrank herself to avoid inconveniencing others. But it's very much like the woman your father married, the principal who turned around failing schools, the mother who taught you to stand up for what's right. I've remembered who I am, Robert, and that person makes her own decisions." They left shortly after, their departure marked by tense smiles and vague promises to talk soon. I watched from the window as they pulled out of the driveway, Robert's hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly I could see the tension in his shoulders even from a distance. When their car disappeared around the corner, I sank into my armchair, suddenly exhausted. The confrontation had taken more out of me than I wanted to admit. For a moment, doubt crept in. Was I being too harsh? Too unforgiving? Should I give Robert another chance to prove himself? Then I remembered his words, spoken so carelessly that day in my kitchen. She won't live much longer. Not sadness at the prospect of losing his mother, just impatience for his inheritance. The memory strengthened my resolve. I reached for the phone and dialed Emma's number. When she answered, I didn't mention the confrontation with Robert and Patricia. Instead, I asked if she could come by on Saturday to help me sort through some old photo albums. I've been thinking about creating a proper memoir, I explained. Something to leave behind that tells the real story of my life, not just the dates and facts. I'd love to help, she said enthusiastically. I could bring my laptop and we could record some of your stories too if you want. That sounds perfect, I replied, feeling the tension begin to leave my body. And Emma, bring your nursing textbooks. I want to hear more about what you're learning. As I hung up, I glanced at Harold's photograph on the mantel. I think you'd approve, I told his smiling image. She reminds me of you, you know, that same kindness, that same integrity. I could almost hear his response. Then you're making the right choice, Ellie girl. For the first time since overhearing my son's callous words, I felt completely at peace with my decision. Whatever storm was coming, and I had no illusions that Robert would accept my choice without a fight, I was ready to weather it. I had spent too many years being the mother everyone expected, selfless, accommodating, increasingly invisible. It was time to be Eleanor again, strong-willed, principled, and very much alive. The rain had stopped, and sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds. I changed out of my robe, put on my gardening clothes, and headed outside. The air smelled of wet earth and possibility. My rose bushes needed pruning, and I had always believed that working with one's hands was the best cure for a troubled heart. As I knelt in the damp soil, carefully cutting away the dead growth to make room for new life, I smiled to myself. Robert had gotten one thing right. I wouldn't live much longer. No one my age could count on decades ahead. But the time I had left would be lived on my terms, with my values intact, leaving a legacy that would bloom long after I was gone. I always believed family was something sacred, something you nurtured through sacrifice and love, through showing up when it mattered, through seeing the best in one another, even when it was hidden beneath layers of human failing. My Harold and I had built our lives around that belief. We'd created traditions, Sunday dinners where everyone was welcome, holiday celebrations that stretched across days, camping trips where smartphones were banned and conversation flourished beneath starlit skies. We'd raised Robert with those values, or so I thought. Harold and I met during our college years, both of us studying education with dreams of shaping young minds. He was tall and thoughtful, with a quiet confidence that drew me in from our first conversation in the university library. We married, the summer after graduation, in a small ceremony beneath the oak trees in my parents' backyard. Our wedding wasn't extravagant by modern standards. I wore my mother's altered dress, we served punch and cake made by my aunts, and our honeymoon was a week-long camping trip to Yellowstone. But it felt like the beginning of something magnificent. Those early years were lean but joyful. We rented a tiny apartment near the elementary school where I taught second grade while Harold pursued his master's degree. We budgeted carefully, saved diligently, and dreamed ambitiously. On weekends, we explored thrift stores and estate sales, gradually furnishing our little home with pieces that had history and character. Harold would refinish old dressers in our building's basement, and I would sew curtains from fabric remnants. Every purchase was considered, every addition treasured. When Robert was born 3 years later, our world expanded in the most beautiful way. I still remember Harold's face the first time he held our son. A mixture of terror and wonder, his eyes glistening with tears as he whispered promises to the tiny bundle in his arms. Robert was a curious child, always asking why and how, his mind working constantly to understand the world around him. Harold and I encouraged his questions, taking him to museums and libraries, showing him how to find answers rather than simply providing them. As Robert grew, so did our careers. I moved from teaching to administration, eventually becoming principal at Lakeside Heights Elementary. Harold completed his doctorate and became a professor of education at the local university. We worked hard, but we always prioritized family time. Our dinner table was a place for discussions, for debates, for dreams to be shared. We taught Robert that success wasn't measured by possessions but by impact, by the lives you touched, the good you did in the world. When had that changed? When had my sweet, thoughtful boy transformed into a man who could coldly discuss his mother's death as a financial windfall? The question haunted me as I sorted through old photographs one rainy afternoon, Emma seated beside me at the dining room table. "Who's this?" she asked, pointing to a faded color photo of a teenage Robert standing proudly beside an elderly man near a fishing boat. "That's Robert with my father," I explained, smiling at the memory. Dad taught him to fish when he was just 7. By the time this picture was taken, Robert was teaching Dad a few tricks of his own. Emma studied the photo. "He looks happy, carefree." "He was," I confirmed, the ache in my chest intensifying. My father didn't have much in terms of material wealth, but he was rich in knowledge, in patience, in love. Robert adored him. "What changed?" Emma asked softly, her intuition cutting straight to the heart of my thoughts. I sighed, placing the photo back in the album. I've been asking myself the same question. I think it happened gradually, almost imperceptibly. The world changed, values shifted, success became defined differently. "That doesn't explain everything," Emma pointed out gently. "Plenty of people navigate changing times without losing their core values." She was right, of course. I couldn't blame societal shifts for my son's transformation. The truth was more complicated and perhaps more painful. "I think it started when Robert met Patricia," I admitted, naming what I'd long suspected but rarely voiced. "She came from wealth, old money, family connections, private schools. She showed Robert a different world, one where status mattered, where the right address and the right car and the right vacations signaled your place in society. And he was seduced by it," Emma concluded. "Completely," I nodded. "At first, Harold and I thought it was just a phase, that he was trying to impress her, to fit into her world. But then we realized he truly believed that life was better, more worthwhile. The things we'd taught him, about service, about finding purpose beyond material success, began to seem quaint to him, outdated." "Did you ever confront him about it?" I shook my head. "Harold tried once. It led to a terrible argument. Robert accused us of being jealous, of not wanting him to surpass us." The memory still stung. After that, we decided to love him through it, to hope that eventually he would find his way back to the values he was raised with. "And you're still hoping?" Emma said, not a question but an observation. "I suppose I am," I admitted, though after what I overheard. I trailed off, unable to complete the thought. Emma reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You're allowed to protect yourself, Eleanor, even from your son." Her words washed over me like absolution, releasing me from the guilt that had been my constant companion since changing my will. Parents weren't supposed to disinherit their children. They weren't supposed to give family treasures to near strangers. They weren't supposed to admit failure in the most fundamental task of parenting, raising a person of character. Yet here I was, doing all those things because the alternative, allowing Robert to profit from my death, to take what he hadn't valued, to treat my life's work as nothing more than a financial transaction, felt like a betrayal of everything Harold and I had stood for. "Thank you," I said simply, returning Emma's squeeze before pulling my hand away to turn the page of the album. "Now, tell me about your clinical rotation this week. Any interesting cases?" As Emma launched into a story about an elderly patient who reminded her of her grandmother, I felt a familiar sense of connection, the kind that comes from genuine interest, from truly seeing another person. It was what had been missing from My relationship with Robert for far too long. The next week brought another confrontation, this one more calculated than the last. Robert arrived alone on a Tuesday afternoon, carrying a small gift bag and wearing his most contrite expression. "I brought your favorite tea," he said as I opened the door, offering the bag like a peace offering. The kind with the rose petals, that you can only get at that specialty shop downtown. "How thoughtful," I replied, accepting the gift, but not the implied apology. "Would you like to come in?" He followed me to the kitchen, watching as I filled the kettle and set out cups. His eyes darted around, taking in details. The freshly painted walls, a project Emma had helped me with over the weekend. The new curtains, the vase of garden flowers on the table. "You've been busy," he observed. "The kitchen looks different." "Just a refresh," I said, though it was more than that. It was reclamation, making spaces that had long been neglected feel alive again, just as I was doing with myself. "Mom, about last week," he began, his tone carefully modulated to convey regret without actually admitting wrongdoing. "Patricia and I were out of line. We should never have suggested you weren't capable of managing your own affairs." I waited, wondering if a genuine apology for discussing my death as a financial opportunity would follow. It didn't. "I appreciate that," I said finally, pouring hot water over the tea leaves, "though I'm curious why you've come alone today. Where's Patricia?" A flash of something, annoyance, frustration, crossed his face before he smoothed it away. "She had a charity committee meeting. Besides, I thought it might be good for us to talk, just the two of us, like old times." Old times. When had we last had a real conversation? Just the two of us? I couldn't remember. "What would you like to talk about?" I asked, setting a cup of tea before him and taking the seat. Opposite? He took a cautious sip before answering. "I've been thinking a lot about Dad lately, about what he would want for us, for the family." The invocation of Harold's memory was calculated, designed to soften me, to remind me of family bonds. I felt a flicker of anger but kept my expression neutral. "Your father wanted many things," I said evenly. "He wanted you to be kind. He wanted you to value people over possessions. He wanted you to live with integrity." Robert had the grace to look uncomfortable. "He also believed in family loyalty," he countered, "in taking care of your own." "Yes, he did," I agreed, which is why he would be deeply disappointed to hear his son discussing his wife's death as a financial opportunity. The words hung between us, impossible to dismiss or explain away. Robert's face flushed. "Mom, what you thought you heard, I know exactly what I heard," I interrupted, my voice firm but not unkind. "The question is whether you're ready to acknowledge it, to take responsibility for it." He stared into his teacup, avoiding my gaze. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "Things have been difficult lately. Patricia's spending has increased. The kids' private school tuition went up again, and the house needs a new roof. I've been stressed about money, about the future." I said things I didn't mean. It was as close to an admission as I was likely to get, but it rang hollow. Stress might explain irritability or impatience. It didn't explain calculating the financial benefit of a parent's death. "I understand stress," I said carefully. "What I don't understand is how my son could see me as nothing more than a balance sheet." "That's not fair," he protested, looking up sharply. "You're my mother. Of course you're more than that to me." "Am I?" I challenged gently. "When was the last time you asked about my day, Robert? My interests? My thoughts? When was the last time you visited without wanting something?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again, unable to provide an answer because we both knew the truth. Our relationship had become transactional long before I overheard his callous words in the kitchen. "I'm sorry," he finally said, the words seeming to cost him tremendous effort. "I've been selfish, distracted. I haven't been the son you deserve." The apology surprised me, less for its content than for its apparent sincerity. For a moment, I glimpsed the boy I had raised, the one who could admit when he was wrong, who could feel genuine remorse. "Thank you for saying that," I said, softening slightly. "I accept your apology." Relief crossed his face, followed quickly by cautious hope. "So, about the will," he began. And just like that, the moment was gone. The apology hadn't been about healing our relationship after all. It had been a strategy to get what he wanted. "The will reflects my wishes," I said, firmly. "That's all you need to know for now." His expression hardened again. "Mom, be reasonable. Whatever I said, whatever you think I meant, I'm still your son, your only child. This house, Dad's things, the family history. It should stay in the family." "Family is more than blood, Robert," I replied, the certainty in my voice surprising even me. "It's shared values, mutual respect, genuine care. I've made my decisions based on those principles." "So you are leaving everything to that girl," he said flatly, any pretense of contrition vanishing. "A stranger you've known for what, 2 years? Over your own son?" "Emma is hardly a stranger to me," I pointed out. "And my estate planning is my business, not yours." "This is insane." He pushed back from the table abruptly, nearly spilling his tea. "You're being manipulated and you can't even see it. That girl has wormed her way into your life, filling your head with ideas, turning you against your own family." "Emma has done nothing of the sort," I said calmly. "She's shown me kindness, respect, and genuine interest in who I am as a person. She's reminded me that I still have value beyond what I can give or leave to others." "Of course she makes you feel that way," Robert exclaimed. "That's how the con works. She makes you feel special, valued, understood, and then she walks away with everything you've worked for." His words stung, not because they contained truth, but because they revealed how little he understood about what truly mattered to me. It had never been about the house or the money or the possessions. It had been about the life Harold and I built, the values we upheld, the difference we tried to make. "You still don't understand," I said quietly. "This isn't about the inheritance, Robert. It's about legacy, about ensuring that what Harold and I built serves a purpose beyond mere accumulation." "And I can't be trusted with that legacy?" The hurt in his voice seemed genuine, but I couldn't tell any more what was real and what was performance. "You tell me," I challenged gently. "What would you do with this house if you inherited it tomorrow?" He hesitated, caught off guard by the directness of the question. "Well, we'd probably sell it," he admitted. "It's too large for a vacation home and too far from our primary residence to be practical. The market in this neighborhood is strong, so we'd likely make a significant profit." "And the antiques? The books? The photographs?" "We'd keep the valuable pieces, of course," he said. "The rest would probably be sold or donated. Patricia has a very specific aesthetic, and most of this." He gestured vaguely around the kitchen. "Wouldn't fit." I nodded, his answers confirming what I already knew. "And what about the scholarship fund Harold and I established at the university? The annual donation to the literacy program at my old school? The holiday food baskets for families in need?" Robert shifted uncomfortably. "Those were your projects, Mom, your interests. We have our own charitable commitments." "I see," I said simply, though what I really saw broke my heart. Robert didn't value what Harold and I had built because he didn't share the vision behind it. To him, our legacy was just assets to be liquidated, capital to be redirected toward his own priorities. "I should go," he said stiffly, standing up. "Patricia will be waiting." I walked him to the door in silence, neither of us having the words to bridge the chasm that had opened between us. As he stepped onto the porch, he turned back, his expression a mixture of frustration and confusion. "I don't understand you anymore." "Mom," he said, "you've changed." "No, Robert," I corrected gently. "I've remembered who I always was." After he left, I returned to the kitchen and poured myself another cup of tea. The conversation had been difficult, but it had also been clarifying. I had given Robert an opportunity to demonstrate that he understood what truly mattered to me, to show that he could be trusted with the legacy Harold and I had built. He had failed that test, not because he was a bad person, but because somewhere along the way, he had embraced values fundamentally different from those that had shaped our family. The realization brought grief, but also a strange peace. I was making the right choice, not out of spite or punishment, but out of a genuine desire to see our life's work continue in the hands of someone who would honor its purpose. Later that evening, as I sat on the porch swing watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, I thought about legacy in a broader sense. What did we leave behind, really, when we departed this world? Not just possessions or money, but imprints on other lives, ripples of influence that extended outward in ways we might never see. Harold had left such ripples. Former students still wrote occasionally, sharing how his teaching had shaped their paths. Colleagues spoke of his integrity, his mentorship, his quiet generosity. His influence lived on in the scholarship fund we had established, in the educational philosophy he had championed, in the countless lives he had touched. I had my own ripples too, students who had flourished under my guidance, teachers I had mentored who went on to lead their own schools, community initiatives I had helped establish that continued to serve local families. And Robert? What would his legacy be? I hoped it would be more than a well-appointed home and an impressive investment portfolio. I hoped that somewhere beneath the materialism and status-seeking, the values we had tried to instill still existed, waiting perhaps for life to humble him enough to remember them. As the last light faded from the sky, I made a decision. I would continue with my plan to leave my estate to Emma, but I would also write Robert a letter to be delivered after my death, not explaining or justifying my choice, but reminding him of who he had been, of the values he had once embraced, of the legacy beyond possessions that was still his birthright if he chose to reclaim it. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it honored both my disappointment in what was and my hope for what might still be. And in the end, wasn't that what parenthood had always been? A delicate balance between accepting reality and nurturing possibility? With that thought, I rose from the swing and went inside, closing the door on the gathering darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to live according to my values rather than others' expectations. And for tonight, that knowledge was enough. The days following Robert's visit passed in a blur of quiet determination. I began systematically reviewing every aspect of my life, considering what truly mattered and what could be let go. It wasn't just about material possessions, though there were certainly plenty of those to evaluate after 76 years of living. It was about reclaiming my narrative, about ensuring that the story of Eleanor Lancaster wouldn't end with a whispered conversation about inheritance in my kitchen. One morning, I called James, my attorney, and asked him to stop by with the necessary paperwork for another adjustment to my will. When he arrived, his expression was cautious. "Another change, Eleanor? You're keeping me busy these days." "Just one addition," I assured him, gesturing for him to take a seat at the dining room table. "I want to establish a foundation." His eyebrows rose. "A foundation? That's quite an undertaking." "I'm aware," I smiled, "but I've given it considerable thought." I want to create something that will outlast me, something that reflects the values Harold and I believed in. James nodded slowly, removing a legal pad from his briefcase. What kind of foundation did you have in mind? The Lancaster Educational Opportunity Foundation, I said, the name coming to me with surprising clarity. It will support first-generation college students pursuing careers in education, particularly those interested in working in underserved communities. As I outlined my vision, scholarships, mentorship programs, practical support for young teachers, James took detailed notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. By the time I finished, his initial skepticism had transformed into genuine enthusiasm. "This is a wonderful idea, Eleanor," he said sincerely. "A truly meaningful legacy." "Thank you," I replied. "There's one more thing. I want Emma to serve as the Foundation's executive director after I'm gone. She'll need guidance, of course. That's where you and the board will come in. But she has the heart and vision to carry this forward." James didn't question this decision, merely nodded and made another note. "We'll need to establish a board of directors, create bylaws, file for nonprofit status. It's a process, but entirely doable. I know just the people to help." After he left, promising to return with preliminary documents within the week, I sat at the dining room table for a long time, staring out at the garden Harold had planted decades ago. The roses were blooming brilliantly this year, their scent drifting through the open window. "What do you think, Harold?" I asked aloud, imagining him seated across from me as he had been countless times during our marriage. Am I doing the right thing? The silence that answered me was peaceful rather than empty. I could almost hear his reply. "You're doing exactly what we always talked about, Ellie. Making a difference that lasts." The next day, I drove to Riverside Park, where Harold and I had walked almost every evening after dinner during our retirement years. The familiar path along the river brought a flood of memories, Harold pointing out unusual birds, collecting interesting stones to add to our garden, stopping to chat with other regular walkers. We had discussed so many important decisions on these walks, the movement and fresh air somehow making complex problems clearer. I found our favorite bench, the one with the view of the river bend, and sat down, feeling the warm wood beneath my palms. An elderly couple walked by, arms linked, and nodded a greeting. I smiled in return, the pang of missing Harold softened by the years, but never completely gone. "Excuse me," a voice interrupted my thoughts. "Is this seat taken?" I looked up, to see a woman perhaps a decade younger than myself, smartly dressed in slacks and a light sweater despite the summer heat. "Not at all," I gestured to the empty space beside me. "Please join me." "Thank you." She sat with a small sigh of relief. "I've overextended myself today. My daughter keeps telling me I need to know my limits, but I've never been good at that." I chuckled. "I understand completely. My son thinks I should be safely tucked away in a retirement community by now." "Children," she said with a knowing smile. "They forget that we were running households and careers when they were still learning to tie their shoes." "I'm Eleanor," I offered. "Margaret," she replied, extending a hand, "though most people call me Maggie." Our conversation flowed easily from there, covering the usual topics between strangers of a certain age. Former careers, she had been a librarian, health challenges, arthritis for both of us, the changing face of the city we both loved. But then it took a more personal turn. "Do you come here often?" she asked. "I used to, with my husband," I explained. "We walked here almost every evening. After he passed, I couldn't bear it for a while. But lately I've been revisiting the places that meant something to us." "How long has he been gone?" 15 years, I said, the number still surprising me whenever I said it aloud. Some days it feels like yesterday, others it feels like a lifetime ago. Maggie nodded in understanding. "My George has been gone 20 years now. Cancer. Too quick and somehow also too slow. I'm sorry, I said, meaning it. Life goes on, she replied, not dismissively, but with the wisdom of someone who had lived through grief and found her way to the other side. I have my children, my grandchildren, my book clubs, my volunteer work. It's a different life than the one I planned, but it's still a good one. That's what I'm discovering, I admitted. That there can be purpose and joy even after you think that part of your story is over. We sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching a pair of ducks navigate the gentle current of the river. My son thinks I've lost my mind, I found myself saying, surprising myself with the confession to a virtual stranger. I've decided to leave most of my estate to someone outside the family, and he can't understand it. Rather than expressing shock or offering platitudes, Maggie simply asked, "And have you? Lost your mind, that is?" The directness of her question made me laugh. No, I don't think so. In fact, I feel clearer about what matters than I have in years. Then you're doing exactly what you should be, she said firmly. One of the few privileges of our age is the right to make decisions based on a lifetime of experience without having to justify them to people who haven't lived long enough to understand. Her words resonated deeply, articulating something I had felt but hadn't quite been able to express. Thank you for that, I said sincerely. No need to thank me for the truth, she replied with a wave of her hand. Now, tell me about this person you're entrusting with your legacy. They must be quite special. As I told Maggie about Emma, her kindness, her intelligence, her genuine interest in my life and stories, I realized how much the young woman had come to mean to me in such a relatively short time. It wasn't just that she visited regularly or helped with tasks around the house. It was that she saw me as a person of value, not just an elderly woman, approaching the end of her life. She sounds remarkable, Maggie said when I finished. And lucky to have found you, just as you were lucky to find her. I never thought of it that way, I admitted. I've been focused on what I could do for her, not what she's already done for me. That's the beauty of real relationships, Maggie observed. The giving and receiving become so intertwined that it's impossible to separate them. We exchanged phone numbers before parting ways, promising to meet for coffee the following week. As I drove home, I felt lighter somehow, as if Maggie's understanding had removed a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. The validation from someone my own age, someone who had navigated similar life transitions, meant more than I expected. When I arrived home, there was a package on my doorstep, a carefully wrapped box with a small card attached. I recognized Emma's handwriting immediately. Inside the house, I opened the card first. Eleanor, saw this and thought of you. Thank you for teaching me that it's never too late to learn something new. Emma. The box contained a beautiful leather-bound journal, the cover embossed with a simple tree design, and a set of high-quality colored pencils. I ran my fingers over the smooth paper, remembering how I'd mentioned to Emma that I'd always wanted to learn botanical illustration but had never made the time. She had listened. Really listened. Not just to the words, but to the longing beneath them. And then she had acted. Not with an expensive gift meant to impress, but with a thoughtful one meant to encourage. I placed the journal and pencils on the desk in the sunroom, already mentally planning when I would begin. Perhaps tomorrow morning, when the light was best. I could start with the roses, learning to capture their complex beauty one petal at a time. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. I answered without checking the caller ID, assuming it might be Emma calling to see if I'd received her gift. Mom? Robert's voice held none of the tension from our last meeting, just a strange hesitation. Are you home? Yes, I replied, my guard immediately rising. Why? Could I stop by? There's something I need to talk to you about. I considered refusing, protecting the peaceful mood of the day, but curiosity won out. All right. When? I'm actually just around the corner, he admitted. I can be there in 5 minutes. True to his word, Robert arrived shortly after, looking uncharacteristically rumpled. His normally immaculate business casual attire was replaced by jeans and a faded polo shirt. His hair, usually perfectly styled, looked as if he'd been running, his hands through it repeatedly. "Come in," I said, stepping aside to let him enter. "Would you like some iced tea? I made fresh this morning." "Please," he nodded, following me to the kitchen. I poured 2 glasses, adding mint leaves from the garden, and set them on the table. Robert took a long sip before speaking. "Patricia and I are separating," he said finally, the words coming out in a rush. "She's filing for divorce." The news stunned me. Despite their obvious flaws as a couple, Robert and Patricia had always presented a united front. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said carefully. "What happened?" Robert stared into his glass. "She's been having an affair with her tennis instructor." He laughed bitterly. Cliché, right? The bored, wealthy housewife and the young athletic coach. Apparently, it's been going on for months. I reached across the table and covered his hand with mine, a gesture of maternal comfort I hadn't offered in years. "Oh, Robert, that must be painful." "The worst part is I didn't even notice," he continued, voice hollow. "I was so busy with work, with maintaining our lifestyle, that I completely missed the signs. Some of her friends knew. Even our club manager suspected, but not me." The irony wasn't lost on me. Robert, who had been so quick to accuse me of being blind to manipulation, had missed deception in his own home. But this wasn't the time to point that out. "How are the children taking it?" I asked instead. "They don't know yet," he admitted. "Patricia's staying with her sister for a few days while we figure out how to tell them." He took another long drink of tea. "The thing is, Mom, she wants the house, and most of our savings. Her lawyer is arguing that her family's connections were instrumental to my career success, so she's entitled to the majority of our assets." "And is that true?" I asked gently, "about her family's connections?" Robert's shoulders slumped. "Partially. Her father did introduce me to some important clients early on. But I built the business through hard work, through delivering results. That should count for something." "It should," I agreed. "Have you spoken with a lawyer?" He nodded. "Yesterday. He thinks we can probably work out a more equitable split, but it's going to be messy and expensive." He looked up at me, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and desperation. "I hate to ask, but I might need a loan, just temporarily, until the divorce is settled." And there it was, the real reason for his visit, for his unusual vulnerability. He needed money. "I see," I said, pulling my hand back from his. "And if I hadn't changed my will, if you were still my primary heir, would you be here having this conversation with me? Or would you still be waiting for me to not live much longer so you could solve your financial problems with my death?" The color drained from his face. "Mom, that's not fair. I'm in crisis here." "So your crisis entitles you to my help, but my feelings didn't entitle me to your concern or respect." I kept my voice calm, not accusatory but firm. "You discussed my death as a financial opportunity, Robert. That doesn't disappear just because now you need me alive and generous." He flinched as if I'd slapped him. "I know what I said was terrible, unforgivable. But it wasn't really about you. It was about my own fears, my own stress. Patricia's spending was out of control. We were fighting constantly about money, and I was grasping at anything that might fix it. Including your mother's death," I said quietly. "I wasn't actually wishing you would die," he protested. "It was just, I don't know, magical thinking, like when things are bad and you fantasize about winning the lottery." "Except I'm not a lottery ticket, Robert. I'm your mother, a person, not a financial safety net." He buried his face in his hands. I know. I know that. And I'm ashamed. More ashamed than I can express. I studied him, trying to gauge the sincerity of his remorse. Was this genuine regret, or just another attempt to manipulate me now that he needed something? The line between the two seemed suddenly blurry. What would you do with the money if I loaned it to you? I asked finally. He looked up, hope flickering across his face. Hire a good lawyer. Find an apartment close to the kids' school so they can stay in their routine. Maybe start building something new, something more authentic than what Patricia. And I had. Something more authentic, I repeated. What does that mean to you? The question seemed to catch him off guard. He thought for a moment before answering. I think it means being honest about what actually matters. These past few days, staying in a hotel room with just a suitcase of clothes, I've realized how little I need most of the things I've spent my life chasing. The only thing that's killing me is being away from Madison and Tyler. For the first time in our conversation, I glimpsed something genuine. A father's love for his children, a value that transcended material concerns. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it was something real to hold on to. I'm not going to give you an answer today, I said after a long moment. I need to think about it. And if I do decide to help you, there will be conditions. Of course. He nodded quickly. Whatever you think is fair. In the meantime, I continued, you're welcome to stay here. The guest room is made up, and it would save you the cost of the hotel. Surprise crossed his face. You'd let me stay? After everything? You're still my son, I said simply. And regardless of what happens with money or inheritance, that hasn't changed. He stared at me, something like wonder in his expression. I don't deserve your kindness. Probably not, I agreed with a small smile. But that's the thing about kindness. It isn't about deserving. It's about recognizing humanity, even in people who have disappointed you. Robert stayed for dinner that evening, a simple meal of soup and homemade bread that we ate at the kitchen table, much as we had when he was a child. Our conversation remained cautious, skirting around difficult topics. But there were moments of genuine connection, too. He asked about my garden. I asked about his children's summer activities. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet, but it was a beginning. After dinner, as he helped me wash the dishes, a small gesture that spoke volumes, he noticed Emma's gift on the desk in the sunroom. You're taking up drawing? He asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Botanical illustration, I corrected. I've always wanted to learn. He picked up the journal, admiring the quality of the paper. This is beautiful. Did you buy it recently? It was a gift, I said, watching his face. From Emma. His expression tightened slightly at the name, but he didn't make a snide comment or dismissive gesture. Instead, he simply nodded and set the journal back down carefully. She seems to know you well, he observed, his tone neutral. She does, I agreed. She pays attention. The words hung between us, not an accusation, but a simple truth. Robert had stopped paying attention to who I was years ago, seeing me only in relation to his needs and expectations. Emma, in contrast, had taken the time to know me as an individual with dreams and interests beyond my role as a grandmother or potential benefactor. I haven't been a good son, he said finally, voicing what we both knew. I've been selfish, entitled, absent when it mattered. Yes, I agreed. Not to hurt him, but because pretending otherwise would devalue the possibility of real change. You have been all those things. Can I fix it? He asked, his voice smaller than I'd heard it since he was a boy facing the consequences of a broken window or a failed test. I considered the question seriously, not wanting to offer false hope or easy absolution. I don't know, I answered honestly. Not quickly, and not with words alone. But you can try. We can both try. He nodded, accepting this answer without argument. "I'd like that," he said simply. Later that night, after Robert had retired to the guest room, I sat on the porch swing with a cup of chamomile tea, reflecting on the day's unexpected developments. Robert's marriage was ending. His carefully constructed life was crumbling. And in the midst of that crisis, he had turned to me, not just for financial help, though that was certainly part of it, but also for the safety and comfort of home. Was this an opportunity for genuine change or just a temporary humbling that would disappear once his crisis passed? I couldn't know yet. But I did know that I wanted to respond with wisdom rather than either naive hope or cynical dismissal. The foundation plans would proceed. Emma would still be my primary heir. Those decisions reflected my values and my assessment of who could best carry forward what mattered most to me. But perhaps there was room in my heart and my plans for Robert too, not because he was entitled to it by blood, but because redemption was always possible, and because second chances, or third or fourth chances, were sometimes where the most profound growth began. As the evening cooled around me, I felt a curious sense of anticipation, as if life at 76 still held surprises and possibilities I couldn't yet imagine. Whatever happened with Robert, whatever came next in this unexpected chapter, I would face it with the clarity and strength I had rediscovered in myself. The woman who had once turned around failing schools, who had stood up to school boards, and angry parents who had never let fear determine her choices. Eleanor Lancaster was wide awake now, after years of sleepwalking through widowhood, and she had important work still to do. The next morning, I woke before dawn, a habit from my years as a school principal that had never quite left me. The house was silent except for the distant hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. I moved quietly down the hallway, not wanting to wake Robert, and settled in the kitchen to start a pot of coffee. As I waited for the coffee to brew, I watched the gradual lightening of the sky through the kitchen window. Dawn had always been my favorite time of day, full of possibility, unmarked by the day's disappointments or triumphs. In those quiet moments before the world fully awakened, anything seemed possible. The coffee maker beeped softly, and I poured myself a cup, adding, "Just a splash of cream." I carried it out to the back porch and sat on the top step, breathing in the morning air scented with dew and roses. The garden was Harold's legacy, though I had maintained it after his death more out of obligation than passion. Lately, however, I had found myself drawn back to it, appreciating the rhythm of growth and renewal, the quiet satisfaction of nurturing living things. "Mom?" Robert's voice came from behind me, surprisingly alert for the early hour. "Mind if I join you?" I gestured to the space beside me on the step. "Coffee's fresh if you want some." "Already helped myself," he said, settling next to me with his own mug. I forgot how good real coffee tastes. Patricia insists on that single-serve machine that makes everything taste like plastic. We sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, watching a pair of cardinals flit among the bushes at the garden's edge. It reminded me of similar mornings years ago, when Robert was in high school and would sometimes join me for early coffee before heading to swim practice. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," he finally spoke, his voice thoughtful. "About fixing things between us." I waited, giving him space to continue without pressure. "I realized I don't even know where to begin," he admitted. "I've spent so long focused on appearances, on creating the perfect-looking life, that I've forgotten what's real." He stared into his coffee cup as if it might contain answers. "I used to know. When Dad was alive, when I was younger. I knew what mattered." "What changed?" I asked gently. He considered the question seriously, not brushing it off with easy answers. "Fear, maybe," he said finally. "After Dad died, I got scared. Scared of not measuring up, scared of failing, scared of losing what we had built. And somewhere along the way, that fear turned into something else. This constant need for more, for better, for proof that I was successful. And now? Now I'm starting over at 52. He laughed without humor. No wife, half my assets gone, living in my mother's guest room. Not exactly the midlife success story I had planned. Perhaps success needs redefinition, I suggested. He looked at me sideways, a hint of his old defensiveness returning. Easy to say when you've had a full life, when you've accomplished what you set out to do. You think I've never failed? Never had to redefine success? I shook my head. Robert, there were years when I thought I'd never become more than an assistant principal. Years when the school board rejected my initiatives. Years when students I believed in made choices that broke my heart. I took a sip of coffee, letting the memories surface. Success isn't a destination. It's a series of moments when your actions align with your values. He was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this. I'm not sure I even know what my values are anymore, he finally admitted. Then that's where you begin, I said simply. By remembering, or perhaps discovering for the first time. The conversation shifted then to lighter topics. A blue heron Robert had spotted by the river during his morning run the previous day. My plans to join a botanical illustration class at the community center. The latest antics of his children as described in late-night text messages. It wasn't profound, but it was authentic. A genuine exchange rather than the performative conversations we'd fallen into over the years. As the sun rose higher, we moved inside, refilled our coffee cups, and I began preparing a simple breakfast of oatmeal with fresh berries. Robert set the table without being asked, finding placemats and napkins in their usual drawer as if he'd never left home. Do you have plans today? He asked as we sat down to eat. Emma's coming by at 11, I replied, watching his reaction carefully. We're sorting through some old photographs for a project I'm working on. His face remained neutral. What kind of project? A memoir of sorts, I explained. Not for publication, just for family. For your children, primarily. I want them to know where they came from, the people who helped shape their world, even if they never met them. Like Dad, Robert nodded in understanding, and my parents, your great-grandparents, all the people whose stories might otherwise be lost. I hesitated, then added, You're welcome to join us if you'd like. Many of the photographs have stories you might remember differently than I do. Surprise crossed his face at the invitation. You wouldn't mind? I mean, given everything. Emma knows about our disagreements, I said carefully, but she also knows that families are complicated, that relationships evolve. She won't be uncomfortable if you aren't. He considered this, then nodded slowly. I'd like that, actually. It's been a long time since I looked at the old albums. After breakfast, Robert helped with the dishes, then excused himself to make some work calls. I took advantage of the time alone to contact James, my attorney, explaining Robert's situation and my tentative thoughts about helping him financially. I'm concerned about balancing compassion with wisdom, I admitted. I don't want to enable patterns that need to change, but I also don't want to withhold help when it might make a meaningful difference. A classic parental dilemma, James observed, though usually faced with much younger children. The dynamics may change, but the essential questions remain the same, I replied. What serves love best? What honors both parties' dignity? We discussed several options. A structured loan with clear repayment terms, a trust that could provide for specific expenses like legal fees or housing near his children, outright gifts for particular purposes. By the end of the conversation, I had a clearer sense of how to proceed if I decided to help Robert financially without compromising the larger decisions I had made about my estate. At precisely 11, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Emma, her arms full of empty photo storage boxes and archival sleeves. I stopped by that specialty shop you mentioned, she explained as I ushered her in. The owner was so helpful when I told him about your project. He threw in some acid-free labels and special markers at no charge. How thoughtful, I smiled, taking some of the boxes from her. Thank you for doing that. I should warn you, though, we'll have company for our photo session today. Robert's staying with me for a while, and he's expressed interest in joining us. Emma's eyebrows rose slightly, but she nodded. Of course. It's his family history, too. He's going through a difficult time, I added, keeping my voice low. His marriage is ending. He's questioning many aspects of his life. Understanding dawned in her eyes. That explains the car in the driveway. I was a little surprised. It's temporary, I assured her, and it doesn't change anything about our arrangements or the foundation plans. I never thought it would, she said simply. You're not someone who changes course without good reason. Her confidence in me was touching, especially given how little time we had known each other compared to the decades of history I shared with Robert. Yet in some ways, Emma understood me better than my own son did. She saw me clearly, without the distortions of childhood expectations or familial roles. We set up our photo sorting station on the dining room table, spreading out albums, loose photographs and the new archival materials Emma had brought. Robert joined us shortly after, greeting Emma with surprising warmth. You must be the famous Emma, he said, extending his hand. I've heard a lot about you. Likewise, she replied with a polite smile, shaking his hand firmly. Though I suspect, from rather different perspectives. He acknowledged this with a rueful nod. Fair enough. Let's just say I'm working on revising some of my assumptions. The initial awkwardness soon gave way to the absorbing task of sorting through decades of family photographs. Robert proved surprisingly knowledgeable about dates and occasions that had blurred in my memory, while Emma asked insightful questions that drew out stories I might not otherwise have shared. Who's this? She asked, holding up a faded color. Photograph of a young woman in a nurse's uniform, standing beside a much younger version of me. That's Sarah, my college roommate, I explained, taking the photo for a closer look. She went into nursing while I pursued education. We lost touch for many years, but reconnected in our 40s. She was the one who introduced me to Harold. Actually. Really? Robert looked surprised. I never knew that. I thought you and Dad met at a university function. We did, in a way. I smiled at the memory. Sarah was dating a professor in the education department. She invited me to a faculty mixer, insisting I'd been buried in work too long and needed to rejoin the land of the living, as she put it. Harold was there presenting research on progressive educational methods. Love at first sight? Emma asked. Hardly, I laughed. We argued about his findings. I thought his sample size was too small to draw the conclusions he was making. He thought I was being unnecessarily rigid in my interpretation of the data. That sounds like Dad, Robert chuckled, always defending his research methods. We didn't even exchange phone numbers that night, I continued. But a week later, he showed up at my classroom with an expanded data set and a request to observe my teaching methods for his next study. Smooth, Emma grinned. It worked, didn't it? I pointed out. 54 years of marriage began with an academic disagreement and a determination to prove one's point. As the morning stretched into afternoon, we ordered sandwiches from the local deli and continued our work, sorting photographs into categories: family events, travel, professional milestones, everyday moments that had seemed worth preserving. The process was more emotional than I had anticipated, not just because of the memories evoked, but because of the unexpected harmony between Robert and Emma. They weren't becoming friends exactly, but they were finding common ground in their interest in my stories, in their questions about the past, in their shared effort to help me preserve these fragments of history. It was more than I had dared to hope for when I extended the invitation that morning. After Emma left, promising to return the following week with more archival supplies, Robert helped me put away the sorted photographs and clean up the dining room table. She's not what I expected, he admitted as we worked. Emma, I mean. What did you expect? I asked, curious about the image he had constructed. He shrugged. Someone more. Calculated, I guess. More obviously trying to ingratiate herself. But she seems genuinely interested in you, in your stories, in preserving things that matter. That's who she is, I said simply. Not a con artist or an opportunist. Just a young woman with a good heart and a capacity for real connection. Robert was quiet for a moment, folding the tablecloth we had, used to protect the dining room table from the archival adhesives. I'm beginning to understand why you've chosen her, he finally said. Not that I'm thrilled about it, but I get it more than I did. It wasn't acceptance, not quite, but it was a step toward understanding. I decided to build on that tentative bridge. I've been thinking about your situation, I said carefully, about how I might be able to help. Hope flickered across his face, quickly tempered with caution. You don't have to, Mom. I didn't come here to— I know you didn't, I interrupted gently. But I want to help on several conditions. Name them, he said immediately. I took a deep breath, organizing my thoughts. First, it would be a structured arrangement, a proper loan with repayment terms, not an open-ended handout. Second, the money would be specifically for securing housing near your children and for reasonable legal representation, not for maintaining the lifestyle you and Patricia created. And third, I'd like you to work with a financial advisor of my choosing to develop a sustainable plan going forward. He listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive. When I finished, he nodded slowly. Those are fair conditions. More than fair, actually. There's one more thing, I added. I'd like you to consider therapy. This caught him off guard. Therapy? You think I think you're going through a major life transition, I clarified. One that involves not just practical changes, but identity shifts. A good therapist can provide perspective and tools that family members can't, precisely because they're not emotionally involved in the same way. He was quiet for a long moment, processing this suggestion. Finally, he sighed. I suppose it couldn't hurt. God knows I've made enough of a mess trying to figure things out on my own. It's not about failure, I said gently. It's about growth. About being intentional rather than reactive as you rebuild. The conversation shifted then to practical matters. How much he would need for an apartment deposit, what kind of legal fees he might be facing, how to approach discussions with his children about the changes ahead. It was the most straightforward, financial conversation we had ever had, free from the undercurrents of expectation and entitlement that had characterized so many of our interactions in recent years. That evening, after Robert left to meet friends for dinner, I called James to set the loan process in motion. Then I reached out to Emma, wanting to check in after the potentially awkward photo session. How are you feeling about today? I asked, when she answered. It was actually nice, she admitted. A little strange at first, but Robert was. Different than I expected based on what you've told me. More human, I guess. Crisis has a way of stripping away pretense, I observed. He's seeing things more clearly now than he has in a long time. Do you think it will last? She asked. The question gentle but direct. I don't know, I answered honestly. People can change, but it usually happens slowly, with setbacks along the way. I'm cautiously hopeful, but not naive. That seems wise, she said. After a pause, she added, Eleanor, I want you to know that whatever happens with Robert, whatever relationship you rebuild with him, it doesn't make me feel threatened or worried about our plans. Family is complicated, and healing is always a good thing when it's possible. Her generosity of spirit moved me deeply. Thank you for that, dear. It means more than you know. After we hung up, I sat in the gathering darkness of my living room, reflecting on the day's unexpected gifts. the easy morning conversation with Robert, the collaborative photo session, Emma's gracious understanding. None of these developments changed the fundamental decisions I had made about my estate and legacy, but they did suggest possibilities for healing that I hadn't dared to hope for just weeks ago. The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. I opened it to find a delivery. Person holding a large, flat package. "Mrs. Lancaster?" he confirmed, extending a digital signature pad. "Special delivery." I signed and took the package, curious about its contents. The return address was from an art supply store in the city, but I hadn't ordered anything. Inside, I found an easel, portable, adjustable, beautifully crafted, and a note in Robert's handwriting. "For your botanical illustrations. Every artist needs the right tools. Robert." I stood holding the easel, momentarily speechless. It wasn't the gift itself, though it was certainly thoughtful. It was the recognition behind it, acknowledgement of my new interest, support for this late-blooming creative endeavor, respect for my identity beyond our relationship. For perhaps the first time in decades, Robert had seen me clearly and responded to what he saw with genuine thoughtfulness rather than obligation. The next morning, I set up the easel in the sunroom where the light was best and placed a single rose from the garden on the small table beside it. I opened Emma's gift, the leather-bound journal, to the first blank page and began to draw, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence. I wasn't concerned with perfection. This was about process, about paying attention, about honoring beauty in its transient forms. As I worked, carefully tracing the curve of each petal, the subtle gradations of color from deep crimson to pale pink at the edges, I thought about legacy in a different way. Not as possessions passed down, or even as financial support for causes I believed in, but as attitudes, approaches to life, ways of engaging with the world. What if the most important inheritance I could leave wasn't material at all, but exemplary, showing by example that it was never too late to learn, to grow, to begin again? Robert had seen me embracing something new at 76 and had responded with encouragement rather than dismissal. Perhaps that small interaction held more transformative potential than any legal document or financial arrangement. Perhaps the real power of legacy lay not in what we left behind, but in how we lived right up until the end, with curiosity, with openness, with a willingness to revise our assumptions and begin again. I didn't abandon my plans for the foundation, or my decision to make Emma my primary heir. Those choices still aligned with my values and my assessment of who would best steward what mattered most to me. But I did expand my vision of what was possible with Robert, not erasing the past or pretending the hurt hadn't happened, but creating space for something new to emerge alongside it. Over the weeks that followed, a new rhythm established itself. Robert found an apartment just 10 minutes from his children's school and began the painful process of dividing up a shared life with Patricia. The divorce proceedings were contentious, at times, but he maintained a dignity that surprised and impressed me, focusing on what was best for Madison and Tyler, rather than on winning or revenge. Emma continued to visit regularly, sometimes overlapping with Robert, sometimes not. The initial awkwardness between them gradually gave way to a cautious, mutual respect. They would never be close. Too much history and too many inherent tensions prevented that. But they developed a cordiality that made family gatherings possible without tension or drama. I divided my time between various projects, the foundation planning, my botanical illustration classes, regular lunches with my new friend Maggie, occasional babysitting for my grandchildren who now spent weekends with Robert in his new apartment. Life felt fuller than it had in years, rich with purpose and connection. One afternoon, as I sat in the garden sketching a particularly vibrant sunflower, Robert stopped by unexpectedly. He looked different than he had that morning when I overheard his callous words in the kitchen, lighter somehow, less polished but more authentic. "I was just driving past and thought I'd see if you wanted company for dinner," he explained. "The kids are with Patricia tonight, and I'm still not used to eating alone." "I'd like that," I said, setting aside my sketchbook. Emma dropped off. "Some homemade lasagna yesterday, far too much for just me. We could heat that up and eat on the porch if the weather holds." "Sounds perfect," he agreed, following me inside. As we moved through the kitchen, gathering plates and silverware, opening wine, preparing a simple salad to accompany the lasagna, I was struck by how comfortable it felt, not the wary politeness of recent years or the obligatory visits marked by glances at watches and early departures, but genuine ease. Later, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Robert turned to me with unexpected seriousness. "I want to thank you, Mom, not just for the loan or for letting me stay here when I needed it, but for—" He searched for the right words. "For not giving up on the possibility that I could be better than I've been. For holding me accountable without writing me off." "You're my son," I said simply. "That doesn't mean unconditional approval or blind acceptance. It means believing in your capacity for growth, even when the evidence suggests otherwise." He smiled slightly. A very principle-like answer. "Once an educator, always an educator," I shrugged, returning his smile. "Some habits never change." We sat in companionable silence as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. The future remained uncertain in many ways. Robert's journey of rebuilding was just beginning. The foundation was still in its planning stages. My own health could change at any time, as was true for anyone my age. But uncertainty no longer felt threatening. It felt like possibility, like an open horizon rather than an approaching end. "She won't live much longer," Robert had said that day in my kitchen, the certainty in his voice chilling me to the bone. He had been wrong, not just morally but factually, because living isn't measured in heartbeats or breaths alone, but in engagement, in purpose, in connection. By that measure, I was more alive now than I had been in years, and whatever time I had left, whether days or decades, would be lived fully, on my own terms, surrounded by people who saw me clearly and valued me for who I was rather than what I could give them. That certainty, born from the painful revelation of my son's callousness but nurtured by my own courage and the unexpected gift of Emma's friendship, was perhaps the most precious legacy I could claim. Not something to leave behind, but something to embody until my final breath. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.